and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. The goal of this series is to make quote-unquote difficult philosophical concepts and ideas more accessible without losing some of the complexity and the richness that makes these arguments so interesting in the first place. And the basic overarching goal, if you will, of this project is to create on-ramps for people so that you can engage in your own learning and reading and studying, because I think it's fair to say that often it can be a little bit difficult to get into philosophy and theory, and it's not necessarily accessible, and there aren't that many people who are willing to invite you into the tradition, so to speak. And so that's the overarching goal and purpose of this video series, to create a open and welcoming space in which these ideas can be introduced. And I like to think of it a little bit as like a nutritional thing. Like in the same way that if you're used to eating a lot of sugar, it can be difficult to suddenly start eating healthy. I think also when it comes to ideas and reading, if your brain is sort of content addled, it can be really difficult to get into the mindset of doing quote unquote more serious and more rich learning and studying. And so hopefully this is like an invitation to sort of diversify your media and idea conceptual diet. And today I'd like to talk about a beautiful, really interesting passage that spoke very strongly to me in Walter Benjamin's essay on Goethe titled Elective Affinities, which is a reference to a work by Goethe. And what I'd like to do in this short video is give you a close reading or analysis, an introduction of this paragraph. And the reason that it spoke to me so strongly, and maybe it will also speak to you, is that Benjamin essentially has a thesis on how we can live amidst turbulent times without losing our minds. He basically comes up with what he calls the task of the critic. And in typically Benjaminian fashion, he actually uses this in a almost tongue-in-cheek way to say that in order to remain hopeful, we have to become alchemists. We have to become alchemists of the mind. We have to not just observe change, but make change, as it were. But that's something that I'm going to discuss in this short video. I'm going to give you sort of a step-by-step introduction into the argument that Walter Benjamin makes, and use it, hopefully, as a way of thinking about how you too, and us too, and myself, can use this idea to feel more, if you will, empowered in our own day-to-day life. If you'd like to support this project, please consider either doing so on Substack or Patreon. I'll put the link in my bio and in the comment section. And of course, a huge thank you to everybody who already supports this project by being a part of our community. So what is the passage that I have in mind here? Well, it's this beautifully poetic image that Benjamin comes up with towards the beginning of his essay on elective affinities, in which he basically describes an enormous funeral pyre burning up all the books that have ever existed, like burning up all the accumulated knowledge of mankind, and standing in front of this fire and feeling a sense of despair in which he feels like, how do we respond to this moment where everything suddenly is uncertain and everything that we believe to be true is lost? It's a very apocalyptic image. In fact, this image of a funeral pyre in which the works are being burnt brings to mind Heinrich Heine's well-known quote that where one burns books, soon one will also burn people. Wo man Bücher brennt, brennt man auch bald Menschen. I see someone in the comments asking for higher volume, and I do apologize. I know this has been a recurring issue. Unfortunately, there is no way for me on my phone that I know of to increase the volume other than to speak louder, and so I can attempt to do so. Please do bear with me. These live streams are imperfect. But before I go deeper into this passage, I want to briefly talk about why Walter Benjamin is worth reading if you haven't done so already. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more of Walter Benjamin's works, I think it can be an interesting entry point, if you will, into reading theory and philosophy. In particular because he's such an experimental writer. Like, When you read Benjamin, one of the things that he manages to do is that he gives you multiple texts in one, which to say there's multiple levels at which you can engage with a text by Benjamin. You can read him for the beauty of his writing, for the imagery that he invokes. He has very accessible examples. You can read him for the tacit irony with which he undermines his own positions and certainties, the way in which he's constantly trying to create layers, if you will, of contradictions within his own thought patterns, thereby never giving in to the sort of smug satisfaction that comes with professed wisdom or self-certainty. But there's also, and I think this is enjoyable as you reread Benjamin and you become a more advanced scholar yourself, he's never afraid to deal with the most, if you will, esoteric philosophical issues in a way that requires a high degree of sophistication and indeed philosophical awareness. And this is, to my mind, where Benjamin is such a delightful writer to read. Like, if you read Adorno, Adorno can be very heavy-handed in his academic tone, very difficult to read, except perhaps in the Minima Moralia, although even here it's not an easy entry point necessarily. Whereas for Benjamin, I think that any reader can find something that they can relish, whether you read his Illuminations, whether you read Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which I think can spark a lot of ideas for our own times, or, and this is one of the beauties of reading Benjamin, you can pick up a relatively random essay, like an essay on Goethe, or even, a 2-page note called The Sacramento Also Turns into the Mythic, and find something delectable, delightful. Like, I literally randomly opened this page, and he writes, "Satan is dialectical." And it's such a wild argument. It makes you think, well, why is Satan dialectical? And then, in fact, I'll read you the whole passage here. "The spirit of the black mass here returns. The sacrament takes the place of love, while love takes the place of the sacrament. The spirit of satanic success prevails and shows marriage reflected as in a mirror. For Satan is dialectical and a kind of deceitful fortunate success. The semblance to which Nietzsche deeply succumbed gives him away, just as the spirit of gravity betrays him." That is a wild paragraph, and in order to understand it, requires a lot of unpacking. I can actually do a little exegesis for you right here. Why would Satan be considered dialectical? Well, first of all, you have to understand that Benjamin enjoys what you might call a certain Gothic imagery. We'll get to that later when he describes the philosopher Critic as an alchemist. And it's almost a little joke for Walter Benjamin. And it's a joke that you have to see in the context of the history of philosophy. In fact, the history also of scripture. I'll break it down because it's a little bit complicated, but I'll break it down in a way that will make sense. So why is Satan dialectical? Well, for Walter Benjamin, if we go back to Platonism and the idea that there is such a thing as essence and appearance, then appearance, the phenomena in the world, are but mere reflections of a divine and holy beauty. In fact, citing, I think it's Anthony later, Benjamin says that beauty, strictly speaking, cannot be considered holy, for it is but a reflection of the divine. Therefore, beauty is something which is rendered suspicious, inasmuch as for Plato, art is always suspicious, as it is a copy of a copy. In other words, if objects in the world, like this pencil stub, are copies of an essential form of pencil, then to draw a picture of a pencil stub is a copy of an essential form. Now, if this is true, then beauty must therefore be false in some way, or at least a mirror of the divine. And Benjamin therefore suggests that if beauty or phenomena are a false reflection of the holy, in other words, they are not holy, Then the dialectic, which transposes the gap between essence and its appearance back into appearance itself, the core of Hegelian phenomenology, then dialectics must be not holy, but unholy. In other words, unholy, in the same way that unheimlich is not something which is alive or dead, but undead, something in between. Therefore, for Walter Benjamin, the dialectic is satanic, namely it is the unholy counterpoint, the Hegelian contradiction, if you will, to Platonic essentialist idealism. Now, that's a level at which most people wouldn't want to engage with Benjamin, and yet it's there. You could find it. It's a little gag about why the dialectic is unholy. And it sort of invites you to understand a much broader tradition of philosophy. And this wit is in Benjamin. It's buried everywhere, but you don't have to engage with it necessarily. That's just one example, I think, of what makes Benjamin such an interesting writer and thinker to engage with today. In fact, I find myself constantly surprised at what I encounter in Benjamin every time I go back to him, and just how playful and alive his thought really is in ways that reveals itself continuously to one over the course of multiple readings. But speaking of that, I'd like to now actually dedicate myself to the reading of this example, this paragraph in his essay on Goethe's elective affinities. And it's important to note before I begin that he's making an argument about what philosophy is and whether it's possible to be a philosopher. In fact, he's not really talking about philosophy, he's talking about being a critic. What is the task of the critic? And for people who are relatively new to philosophy, it's sort of important to note that when we talk about a critic in philosophy or in theory, we're not really talking about what most people understand in terms of like a movie critic or a food critic. In fact, we're almost talking about the exact opposite. Let me explain. So when we think of a food critic or a movie critic, we usually think of someone who reviews something, who helps us decide whether or not we want to consume it or partake in it. Like a food critic will help us decide if we should go to a certain restaurant, and a movie critic will help us decide if we should go and see a certain movie. Which is to say, this form of criticism, as we understand it today, is in fact normative criticism. It's a ranking of sorts. It's an opinion of someone's experience that we can then use to inform our own decision-making process. And essentially, it's also influenced by consumer participation, which is to say we like to think of ourselves as educated consumers who can choose the right movies and the right food, etc. And so a critic is today, at least, someone who gives you a normative evaluation, i.e. whether or not something is good or worth doing or having, so that you can make your own judgment. Of course, the other use of the term that you're probably familiar with is the idea that everyone's a critic. Everyone has an opinion, usually a negative one. However, these are strictly speaking watered down versions of what used to be a completely different understanding of what criticism is. In fact, what the function of the critic is. And Benjamin has a really interesting distinction here that can help you understand what a critic is. He says, we have the subject matter and we have the truth of the matter. And the subject matter is how something appears to us directly in its given form. For example, let's say that you watch something happen in the street, or you read the newspaper, or you go to a movie. You perceive the world in a certain way, and this evokes a response in you. This is the substance of the matter, essentially. However, for Benjamin, there is another level of interpretation or understanding, which is the truth of the matter. And the truth of the matter always looks at a structural or hidden component that reveals the essential relation of the thing in its immanent contradiction. Now, that's a very technical way of saying that it's essentially a critique of ideology. To inquire into the truth of the matter isn't to focus on the thing in its appearance, but rather to take a step back, as it were, and to look at the historical situation in which the thing appears in the first place. It's essentially a Kantian reduction, which is to say one of Kant's innovations in philosophy was to say, before we engage in the analysis of essence or appearance, we have to ask the a priori question, namely how these questions can be formulated to begin with. In fact, I think a lot of people are surprised when they realize that Kant is in many ways the godfather of Ideologie Critique, or the critique of ideology, because Kant's central question is always to say, well, we know this, or we think we know it, but how do we even get to the point where such a knowledge could be articulated? And what are the preconditions that we simply take for granted, the assumptions that we make in order to create this proposition in the first place? And so in many ways, none of the theorizing that the Frankfurt School does or Walter Benjamin does would be possible without a critical engagement with the central animus of Kantian philosophy. Indeed, even the title, The Critique of Pure Reason, is already this project of taking a step back to say, let us first properly understand the terminology that we're using and the assumptions that we have to make in order for these questions to be raised. And so Walter Benjamin says, to recap briefly, we have the subject matter, and then we have the truth of the matter. And the task of the critic is actually to ignore the subject matter and its normative appearance, and instead to focus on the truth of the matter. This is actually something I've talked about before in reference to Slavoj Žižek's concept of the hermeneutic temptation. And hermeneutics is essentially an interpretive framework or mechanism. And Žižek says that when it comes to everything that's happening in the world, like explosive violence and the things that grab our attention, it's actually quite important to not directly look at these things, but instead to inquire into the ideology that underlies it, and to sort of write about the structural, indeed often hidden and obfuscated violence that underpins the continuation of other forms of extreme injustice and human suffering. This is what Žižek calls the hermeneutic temptation. It is the temptation to be focused on the content, as it were, rather than to focus on the form hidden in the content. And I mean content both in the sort of popular use of the term, the content you scroll through on your phone, the doom scrolling, versus the sort of critique, if you will, of the very preconditions through which we access media in such a way. But not to get too much off the point, Walter Benjamin therefore says that the task of the critic is to focus on the subject, not to focus on the subject matter, but to focus on the truth of the matter. And to illustrate this, he gives this wonderfully poetic image of a funeral pyre in which all the books of the world are being burned. And he says, we can imagine two different archetypes looking at this catastrophe and having two very different responses. The first person, the first archetype in this allegory, if you will, is the chemist. And the chemist is simply interested in the flame. He's interested in how the books are burning, he's interested in the temperature, he wants all the data and the stats, and he knows that what's happening is bad, but he's also interested in the event as such. He wants to measure it and observe it and sort of normatively reflect upon its occurrence. Against this archetype of the chemist, we have the alchemist. And Benjamin is, again, being a little bit playful here, right? Because we all know that alchemy is like a pseudoscience, a fool's errand. It was something that never resulted in anything meaningful. The desire to bring about change and to, create the philosopher's stone, etc. It's almost the image of, it's almost the inverse image, the satirical image of the philosopher as a crazy madman. And so Benjamin's already playing around with this Gothic motif. Instead of saying, well, we have to be these wise sages, who look at the fire and ponder it, he's saying, no, we should be like an alchemist. We should be trying to create something that is absolutely impossible. So what does the alchemist do? Well, he says the alchemist looks at the flame, the funeral pyre in which all these books are being burned, and yet he's not really interested in the flame, the temperature, He's not interested in preserving the wisdom of the past. Instead, the alchemist, as an archetype here, is the one who tries to understand the flame in its very emergence, and therein keeps a different type of flame alive. In fact, Benjamin comes up with two flames: the objective flame of the fire versus the flame of critique and critical analysis, through which you create something, whether it's art or speaking or an intellectual contribution, which gives license to other people to create. And therefore, even though all the books have been burnt, all the new books and all the new ideas are created. It's a very Hegelian image in a sense, because he's, in the same way that Hegel always argued that you don't get to choose the time that you live in, to sort of cite Lord of the Rings for a moment, Hegel believed that the task of the philosopher was to be ruthlessly both naive and realistic about the times in which he was living. That the privilege of being alive today is that you can think things and process ideas in a way that no one else could before you, not even Hegel himself. Therefore, you are both cursed to live in this era, but you are also privileged because there's an opportunity for reflection, and there are things happening that could only be happening right now. And this is where I want to briefly read a passage from this paragraph in Benjamin, because I think it's very moving. He says, in fact, I'll give you the whole passage if you'll bear with me here. If, for the sake of a simile, one views it as a flaming funeral pyre, then the commentator stands before it as a chemist, the critic like an alchemist. Whereas for the former, wood and ashes alone remain the objects of his analysis, for the latter, only the flame itself preserves an enigma, the enigma of whatever is alive. The critic therefore asks about the truth, whose living flame continues to burn over the weighty foundering of what once was, as well as the light ashes of what was lived through. And the object of study here is what Benjamin calls the realia. The realia being not simply the objective phenomena that appear to you, but the specific historical situation in which you find yourself and the contradictions that emerge in it. And it's a tacit invitation, I think, to not allow yourself to be overwhelmed or overcome by despair, but to realize that the task of being a critical thinker, as someone who's alive and attuned to the world, is precisely to think it and to create meaningful ideas and thoughts, not despite it, but because of it. In fact, I've cited this before, but this is one of my favorite lines from Bertolt Brecht, in which he writes, "In the dark times will there be singing?" And the answer is yes, there will be singing about the dark times. And essentially that's what Benjamin is arguing here. He's saying, in the dark times, is there still a possibility for thought? And he says, yes, it is precisely in the dark times that thought is needed most. In fact, it is against the backdrop of dark times that thought emerges in its imminence, as it were. And so I think it's a very hopeful image that Benjamin has here. It essentially invites and encourages us to be engaged in philosophy and literature and ideas, and therefore to steel ourselves without hardening ourselves. Which is to say, I think on the one hand, we have to learn to not succumb to feeling overwhelmed and despairing all the time, but we also can't simply tune it out. We have to find ways to process it. We have to find ways to feel engaged and like we have license ourselves. And I think you can do this by means of speaking and writing and creating and organizing. And there's so many ways, I think, in which to say it is because the times are changing that we have to make our own change. In fact, here you can also see once again why Benjamin uses the alchemist as an archetype for the philosopher as critic. Not the figure of wisdom who tells you what is to be done, who comes up with a 10-step solution to create a better world, but precisely the alchemist as a dreamer of foolish dreams, not so much a figure of hope as much as a figure of a future hope, as it were. And this is the spirit of the alchemist, the one who is dissatisfied with the idea of simply observing change. It is the one who wants to make change. And therefore the alchemist, for Benjamin, is a slightly revolutionary figure, a figure who is an idiot to some extent, but also an enthusiastic, enlightened idiot who constantly pushes the boundaries of what can be thought and done and imagined. It's like the '68 slogan, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." And indeed, as times grow worse, this is the type of madness that one has to hold on to, the madness of continuing, nevertheless, precisely under such conditions, to create and to live and to make a meaningful, if you will, contribution to one's own life and hopefully to the lives of others. Now, this is simply one level at which, with which we can engage with Benjamin. It's simply one paragraph in a much longer argument that he's making about dialectics and morality and how to interpret Goethe, of course, for let us not forget that this is an essay on Goethe's elective affinities. But there's an image that Benjamin has elsewhere that I think is actually quite helpful here, where he says, we have to imagine the substance, like the content of the world, as a wax seal on a letter. And the task of the critic is to break the seal to find the truth of the matter within. And of course, there's very Lacanian overtones to this, which is to say one of Lacan's central arguments is precisely that there is nothing behind this seal. There's no hidden content in the letter as such. There is only the truth of the barrier itself, the truth of the seal, which is an argument that Benjamin essentially also makes. It is that there is nothing behind the mask save for the mask itself. In fact, I don't really have time to explain this here, but Benjamin then continues to write about marriage. In fact, he says, marriage can be seen as an interesting example of how one might perform a dialectical criticism of marriage, which is to say, if you truly love each other, then why do you need to get married? But vice versa, your love emerges retroactively to you as being somehow preordained or necessary at the exact moment that you choose to make it a formal union. In the same way that a couple that consists of two random people who meet each other then retroactively feel like they were always meant to be, and yet if they were actually always meant to be, if they were set up to be with each other, it would no longer be love. And for Benjamin, love is therefore this ineffable X, this crack between the formalization of a union and the contingent encounter with an other that appears to us retroactively as an imminent necessity. And here we have an analysis, if you will, of what Benjamin calls the truth of the matter. And now to loop back to where I started randomly on why Satan is dialectical, here you can see how this joke actually continues, which is to say, if marriage is a holy sacrament, then the satanic way of undermining marriage is precisely to point out the dialectical truth buried within the notion of marriage as such, which nevertheless tacitly reveals love as an authentic philosophical concept. Therefore, the quote-unquote satanic reduction, the dialectical turn, the critical inquiry into the truth of the matter over and above the normative moralizing substance of the matter reveals a truth, reveals an essence, which is therefore precisely quote-unquote holy. Therefore, the Benjaminian gag, if you will, is that the fall into dialectics, the fall from paradise into satanic dialectics is in fact the ultimate truth procedure, the ultimate process by which we can both remain alive as critically thinking subjects, engaged in the world with a stake in it, and yet we also become, if you will, the manifestation of what Aristotle would have called thought thinking itself, the dialectical progress by which our very subjective interaction with the world creates the preconditions for the unfolding of what you might call a Hegelian spirit. And I'd like to conclude on the fact that Benjamin is never encouraging us to step back for an objective analysis. He's not saying look away from the fire to think about it rationally and objectively. No. For Benjamin, after the fire, no objectivity is possible. We can no longer rely on the seemingly self-validating authority of previous wisdoms and assumed and received knowledge. Instead, we must think amidst the ashes of what once was and what will someday be. That is the Benjaminian project, to continue to think, to continue to be witty and alive and intellectually engaged amidst a period of historical change and socio-political turmoil. And I find that a very empowering message, and hopefully this will also invite you not only to keep reading and writing and creating, but perhaps also to think about learning a bit more about Benjamin and reading some of his works. If you're interested in reading Benjamin, perhaps one recommendation would be The Illuminations, or Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, or indeed, if you're interested in a sort of less known version of Benjamin, you could read his writings on Goethe. That is my lecture for today. Thank you so much for being here with me. The goal of this project is to make quote-unquote difficult ideas and concepts more accessible without losing the complexity that makes them so interesting in the first place. If you'd like to support this project, please do consider becoming a patron or joining my Substack. The link is www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week. On a little side note, I usually record a bonus Discord podcast, and I see in the comments already that people are looking forward to it. Unfortunately, Jeneline is currently away taking care of her mother, and so I regret to inform you that today I will not be hosting a Discord session. But fret not, I will be using the additional time that I have to myself to post some exclusive content for patrons later this week. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week. I really do appreciate it. Bye-bye.